Welcome to Shoreside, the Coastal Resilience Podcast and the most resilient podcast in the world. Funded by the Department of Homeland Security, broadcasting from beautiful Chapel Hill, North Carolina, we speak with the undisputed experts in coastal resilience. Bruce Rosenblum here with you once again. And we kept you waiting for episode 3. Real sorry about that. Dr. Chris Massey from U.S. Army ERDIC was a tough act to follow, but we're back and we're better than ever with another very special guest. In fact, maybe the most special guest when it comes to coastal engineering and construction. Based out of Oregon State University, this esteemed doctor ran one of the only labs in the world that can generate ocean-style waves and put real buildings through hurricane damage tests in real time. And on top of that, if you've stayed in any beach house in the country, then you've been protected by structural standards that he helped pioneer for us all. Introducing Dr. Dan Cox. Doctor, it's an honor and a privilege to be with you today.
Thank you for having me.
You're most welcome. I can't say it enough. Your resume speaks for itself, and the timing on this one, it couldn't be more perfect because around this time last year, as you know, Hurricane Ian, it nearly wiped a few islands and pretty much the entire state of Florida off the map. This was like an apocalypse level storm. And you just got back from Fort Myers a little while ago. Tell us what you've been up to.
Yeah, we went to Fort Myers a couple of times. Soon after Hurricane Ian hit, I think we were there about 2 months after the storm. And then have just been making trips back ever since. Big part of it is to see the initial damage, kind of learn what we can from it, and then also the recovery, how that's going and what people are doing to prepare for the next one. So that's what those missions are for.
And what's the takeaway here? Is progress being made?
Yeah, it's interesting. I think that the areas that are further inland, where it was just primarily flooding and wind, they seem to be back. Still a lot of issues directly on the coast, the areas that experienced what we would say like above design level conditions. So right on Fort Myers Beach, Estero Island, still a long way to go.
Ooh. How long do you think we're talking until they'll be back to normal, or will they be back to normal at all?
Well, they'll be back for sure. It'll just be different than it was but pre-storm. There's a lot of, older buildings, older, smaller. I think what were initially, you can almost say like fishing shacks that were set up and then communities built around, just over time. And then just a lot of the older building stock just is completely gone and can't be rebuilt the same way. We have to move to different standards. So it's going to look different when it comes back, but the town certainly will come back.
Fantastic news. And you're in a unique position right here to see all this. Hurricane Ian, it's a huge deal, but it didn't necessarily hit close to home for you. I want to mention 2 towns. Landenberg, Pennsylvania, and Scarborough, Maine. What can you tell us about those 2 towns?
Yeah, these are closer to the areas where I grew up. My East Coast kid, Mid-Atlantic, but we spent a lot of time going up to Maine, up to Scarborough. And I think that's kind of where I fell in love with the coast and the beaches and just going back every summer. And, honestly didn't know really what I wanted to do in college, but kind of found an opportunity to, math, science, engineering. And then there was this whole field of coastal engineering. So that was kind of a lucky coincidence that upbringing, being close to the coast, kind of matched my interest when I got to college. So it was pretty cool.
It's fantastic. A lot to love about the New England coastline. And I'd say you were definitely in the right place to be set up for your career eventually. And you've got a major Delaware connection here, as you said. What can you tell the people about the Center for Applied Coastal Research?
Yeah, that's where I got my start in college. When I decided to go to graduate school, it was sort of right in my backyard. And I was like, how can, they're telling me I was a great center for coastal research. And I'm like, well, how great can it be? I'm from Delaware. But it turned out it was a fantastic place to learn what coastal engineering is about. Friends I still have from grad school, still talk to them, still meet with them, still trying to figure out stuff together, the things that we were learning back then. First time I heard about climate change, and that was, a couple decades ago. So I think it was a great start. And I think probably one of the best things that are the people and the ideas that were being brought up at that time.
Ooh, and I think we're all grateful that you made the choice to go into that field, because you've done things that have had a profound impact, and we'll get to those a little later. But I just want to ask, was there any defining moment or storm or anything that really made you want to go into that Center for Applied Coastal Research?
Yeah, that's a good question. I think a lot of it was the people, my teachers, and I think just a couple of people, just the way they were explaining coastal engineering, that there's not an answer in the back of the book, that you're going to have to go out, figure it out. Every case is different. You have to, the shorelines are all different. And that really appealed to me. I think some of the other, let's say, other areas of engineering just didn't seem as open, but coastal engineering, you definitely have to, look at it from a lot of different perspectives. So I really kind of like that. And then I think just the challenge of it was just seemed really new and, pretty open to needing some of these solutions still today. I'm sure we'll get to that in the conversation too, but with, communities like Fort Myers Beach, looking for solutions. How do we rebuild? What do we do now?
I think everyone in our community would agree that resilience is a problem with no standard solution. And that's really why we're here. We have so many brilliant minds within this organization, within this entire sector, trying to figure out how we can really help people in this regard.
Yeah, I totally agree. And I think part of the reason there's no single solution, there's no single point of view. We're not looking at a scientific principle, scientific discovery that's just waiting to be found. It's really just coming up with how do we manage our risks on the coast. And some people are very risk averse. Some people are more risk tolerant. Same with communities, so people have different attitudes, opinions, and just how they perceive things. So there's not going to be a single solution. This is what we discovered, and this is how it's going to work. I think a lot of it is trying to bring communities together, but also some recognition that some of the things that we did in the old days, we just can't do it. We just can't keep doing the same old thing. We have to change a little bit. And that's tough, I think, for a lot of people.
Ooh, I really want to dig into that a little bit more. What's something that was done in the past that you've seen that we no longer do, or a tactic that has evolved from your perspective?
Yeah, that's a good point. I would say I don't think we quite understood how dynamic some of our shorelines are. And I think for us, just how much change there is on our shoreline. So let's say after World War II, hey, there's a car, we can drive out here, we can get out to the coast, out to the Outer Banks, or barrier islands all along the United States. I think we just didn't appreciate how dynamic these systems are. And when we put something out in place, our infrastructure, our highways, bridges, really, we should have been thinking 100 years into the future, but we were, I think, at that time, not thinking 100 years. But that's, I think now looking back, let's say, for example, 50 years ago from when we expanded, it's like, wow, things are different. And maybe we put some things in a high hazard area that maybe we shouldn't have.
And it's so tough to think that far ahead into the future, especially in this day and age. We're in the age of YouTube where it's hard to think 5 seconds into the future, much less 50 years. So our work is cut out for us for sure. But talking about the people that inspired you and helped you along the way, I want to drop the name of somebody who might have been very important to you at school, Nobuhisa Kobayashi. What can you tell us about Nobuhisa Kobayashi?
Yeah, he was my mentor. He was the guy who really got me started and got me excited about coastal engineering. I think he also took a chance on me. I would say I was not the A student coming out of undergrad, so he kind of took a chance on me. And I think being local kid, wanting to what else is there beyond Delaware? How can I see something else? He made a connection to Japan. So it was, he's originally Japanese, and helped me get to another laboratory in Japan in University of Kyoto, where I was able to go for about a year and a half and then come back and continue my studies. So he kind of opened up my eyes to, a different country, a different culture, but then also this is global stuff that we're working on. This really is something that is worldwide, this field of coastal engineering and what we're doing.
Absolutely. It's really is amazing how one person, one mentor can make such a profound impact in somebody's life. And what's also interesting, you picked up your master's in civil engineering in '89. That was pretty much the end of a domestic chapter in your life and then the start of an international one. You went to the Disaster Prevention Research Institute in Kyoto, Japan. What can you tell us about that experience?
Yeah, again, it was very eye-opening. I think just how valued the coastal engineering is in Japan. They're an island. They're getting attacked by everything, typhoons, tsunami. They have not much land to work with. It's extremely crowded on the coast, you could say. And so just seeing the prominence of that field of coastal engineering in Japan and the way they approach their shoreline, hey, we've got to deal with these issues head on. So that was kind of cool. I think I really enjoyed my time there. Again, making friends, colleagues, people I still keep in contact today. I think they have a very long range mindset. When you kind of form this friendship, these partnerships, it's for life, really, for some of these relationships. And so I kind of took that to heart too, that, when you work with people, you got to think long term.
That's true. And to that point, you actually ended up going back. We'll talk about that very shortly, but I just want to know, what was your favorite thing about being over there and the risk tolerances in Japan for coastal construction? Are they any different than they are here?
Yeah, it's a good question. I think they did a lot of work to set the standards for, how, let's say, for example, armoring shorelines or the equations used to develop breakwaters and things like that. So they had really advanced a lot of the work, how you look at waves and the forcing by the ocean on coastal structures. So definitely learned a lot. I met one of the big guys, Professor Goda. So it was kind of an honor to get to meet him and see his work, still use his stuff, and have actually tried to introduce some of that work in some of our recent standards. So it was excellent. Really enjoyed that the first chapter, I guess, in Japan.
And you also received a fellowship award, I believe, from the Japan Society for the Promotion of Science, and that was in 2010.
Yeah, that was a real honor to enable me to go back to Japan again with JSPS, and enabled me to bring my family along. We got to stay there for a full year. And coincidentally, that 2010, 2011 timeframe was when they were hit by the terrible tsunami, major global event, really, when the Tohoku earthquake and tsunami happened. So that was during the time that I was there.
Wow. What was it like to be in Japan during an actual tsunami?
Yeah, it was, it was memorable in the sense of like a lot of, so we weren't very close to the actual disaster. We were never really in harm's way. But there was several people like me, foreigners living in Japan, deciding, do we stay or do we go? Right. Maybe this is time just to exit early. And I even had my colleagues say, hey, if you don't want to stick around, that's totally understandable. Because there was, in addition to the earthquake, the tsunami, then came the meltdown of the nuclear power plant. And then that got even more people, it was sort of this cascading disaster, and was not looking too good for a while. And then, but we decided to stay because, again, there wasn't a health risk for us where we were. And then I worked with some colleagues to take several trips to the impacted areas, the areas that had been hit by disaster. And just really, you could almost say like career changing impression, experience of what was going on.
Was there any one thing that you saw that really stood out in your mind? Because like you said, when it rains, it pours, and all this stuff happening back to back, memorable stuff for sure.
Yeah, it was, I would say the first, the time we went out was with two colleagues, two friends of mine, Japanese, and they worked to get us sort of into one area, and we met the area, where you had to get authority to go past a certain point, and you could just see the look on people's faces that they probably hadn't slept in the last days, just the faces of just the amount of work that those guys were going through just to deal with the emergency situation. Right. And this was already, weeks and weeks after the initial impact. And then just the first site we went to, sadly it was an elementary school. And so then you just see people's lives and what was torn apart. The happy ending for that story is that it was the students, elementary school kids, went up on the roof, and they actually were all saved by being up on a building that was strong enough to withstand the tsunami. So it turned out to have a happy ending, but just the power of just the visual impression of seeing minute details, a little backpack or a pair of shoes, just floors you, when you first see it.
Visceral, something that definitely stays with you for sure. Wow.
Yeah, and something, I know the professional photographers, they capture a lot of it, but then I think, like all of us, once you're there and you see it, you see the scale of it, you have to be changed after you've seen that. And then the other thing was that how much this was replicated from town to town. So we went with my colleagues, we went up the coast, and then again, the scale of it, like this level of destruction is just being replicated town after town. So it was pretty tough in the beginning, and then after, now let's just do our job. But
is there anything you've seen stateside compared to that?
I've seen some. For example, we went out after Hurricane Irma and Maria in U.S. Virgin Islands, and there are definitely some hard hit areas, and same with Fort Myers Beach. Sure. I would say in general, though, the tsunami in Japan, I think mostly just because of the extent of it, that it was just never ending. I don't think I've seen anything like it since.
You definitely got a background in tsunamis and wave impacts. And what's fascinating is that your mentor, Nobuhisa, he published a paper on wave impacts to structures back in 89. That's the same year you got your master's, also the same year that the Navy started investing in wave basins at the Hinsdale Wave Research Laboratory. And you know all about that lab. What can you tell the people about the Hinsdale Wave Research Laboratory?
Yeah, this is a really unique facility here at Oregon State University. The first investment in it was back in 1972. So we have been at it for about 50 years. And in the 80s, as you mentioned, the Navy invested substantial money to expand this facility for coastal research, nearshore research of interest to the Navy. So it was a major addition or expansion of the facility. And it's really unique to the United States. It's one of the largest coastal research laboratories in the U.S. And it's was expanded for tsunamis in 2000. That's when I joined, around 2002, and that was from the National Science Foundation. So that was kind of like the third phase, was to expand it even more to accommodate tsunamis and to kind of open it up, if you will, as a shared resource, shared use facility, which was really cool. They sort of prepaid the cost of using the facility, and then people could write proposals to NSF. If they won the award, then they could use the facility for free. So it was really a cool way to create this national asset, this national resource that people could use. And it was fun to be a part of that.
It really is a resource. And I'm glad you talked a bit about the scope for our listeners, because this thing really is huge. It is massive. I encourage all of our listeners to go and look it up. Just take a look at it and see for yourself, because it is a sight to see. And you ran it for many years. Let me ask you, is there anything else like this in the world? And what does it take to keep something like this going?
Yeah, that's a great question. I would say I can't think of any. There may be a few, but not many that are at a university. So that's a huge difference. Usually worldwide, when you find something like this, like in Japan, they have a huge tank, huge flume, but it's at their national laboratory, the Port and Airport Research Institute. There's a large one in Germany. That's a shared one at two different universities. And then there's a large one, for example, in Holland, that's kind of semi-private. So it's pretty unique to have something like this at a university, number one. And then, just in terms of scale, something that can generate a full-scale wave, literally something that's surfable, just doesn't exist in many places worldwide, and pretty much in the U.S. This is the big one.
It's the only one in the U.S. It's where it happens.
Outside of Disney World, yeah.
Right, and then the smaller water parks across the country that have their oceans, their fake oceans and stuff. No, this is overstated. This is the real thing. This is the actual real deal. Like you said, surfable style waves. You can do that at this place. It's exceptionally cool, and
highly controlled lab. And I think the other one too is it also helps to provide a focal point for researchers. We'll have a big project in the summer, and sometimes we'll just get people wanting to be a part of that project for a couple of weeks, and then they might phase out. So it also helps to provide a focal point for the research, and also identifying what research needs to be done. I think that's another important part. We're not all going to do it at OSU, of course. But we can help to be a catalyst and help pull people together to have those discussions. What really needs to be done next.
Seems like one of those cases of, if you build it, they will come. And it got built, and now you have all these incredible minds getting together over this thing to do some incredible things. And
yeah, definitely. I think trying to set the research agenda, like what, let's say, for example, things like Fort Myers Beach, Hurricane Ian. Well, what would need to be tested in the future to help improve these types of buildings? What could we be doing on the research side that is going to improve what we could be doing in community resilience?
And that's something I'd like to dig into. Any
Sure.
particular projects that you can recall from your time there or outside of your time there?
Yep.
Any projects that really you think made a big impact in what we're doing here?
Yeah, there's a couple projects. I would say one project. This is going back some time, mid 2000s, but it was the first time we built a sort of a replica scaled coastal community and ran a tsunami into it. That was the city of Seaside. And up to that point, we had been doing kind of like, you could just say boxes or geometric shapes, which are typical for academics to want to look at.
Right.
And I was talking to the director of our Oregon Sea Grant, and he said, why not make it a real town? Like, if you were to change it to make it look like a real town, maybe people would be more interested in your research. And I thought, like, yeah, but it just almost seems like we're, let's say, pandering or something, like trying to get attention. He says, no, if you still have a scientific mission, that'll take care of itself. But then you open up for the rest of the world to see what you're doing. And we ended up even painting the buildings, which had no real scientific value, but it looked like a Monopoly set, when you're all done. And it was great advice because, without people kind of seeing it and getting into it and then commenting, and it was like a positive feedback where you say, okay, we got to keep going. So that was one of that Seaside Tsunami project. And we still share the data. People still use it. So that was a big one.
I love that. I really love that. Not just the fact that you built a fictional city from ground up, but also your reasoning behind it, wanting to open up the research for a wider audience. That's a big part of my job. That's what I'm here to do. And these stories need to be told. And you guys definitely got ahead of that, which is fantastic to me. Yeah,
and I just have to give credit to our Bob Maloof, our former Sea Grant director, for just kind of challenging us and say, hey, why don't you? And my concern too was, well, what will the city think? And his response was, well, why don't you ask them? It's like, well, yeah, I guess we ought to just call them up. And their response was fantastic. They said, well, we trust Oregon State University. We know you're not trying to make a Hollywood movie out of this or scare people, and any good science is going to benefit us in the long run. So they were on board. So it was a really positive conversation. I didn't know which way it was going to go, but yeah, you kind of have to. And I think they appreciate the heads up too, that they're going to be featured and it's going to be, part of the, the scientific discussion. So it worked out.
So Seaside, then you modeled it. You modeled that town after Seaside. That's a real town then.
Correct.
Ah, okay.
I know it sounds fictitious, like any town USA, but Seaside is a real community. It's up here. It's in the Pacific Northwest. It's almost like ground zero. It's like the poster child for what could happen if a tsunami were to hit. And so they're very proactive, on evacuation planning and mapping, and they're definitely on the ball. But it was, if you looked at an aerial photograph of Seaside, there's a very unique condominium. It's in the shape of a U. If you look at ours, and we even painted the river. We were not hiding that we were trying to replicate a portion of that downtown.
Now this is fascinating. You mentioned Hollywood. This has got Netflix documentary written all over it. A team of brilliant researchers trying to recreate an actual town to study the effects of wave impacts. That's really cool. We have to follow up on that at some point because there's a lot of stuff to talk about on that one. But what's also wild to me, though, is that the government has dropped a ton of money into projects like these, Seaside and everything else, when you were coming up. And then you actually returned the favor. You went on to testify before Congress about how universities can really help the government in a kind of a special way. Can you tell us more about what you said to our representatives?
It's funny. I wish I could remember what I said. I was just awestruck that they would even ask me my opinion. I remember that again, tsunamis were on the forefront after the Indian Ocean tsunami, and can it happen here? What would what would our response be? And I think mostly just trying to encourage that we have to do research on the impact to the built environment. Like, we can't just study the hazard. We have to study what happens to us, our communities. And so I just tried to champion a little bit on the engineering side of things, because I know that there are others championing the warning systems and the science behind the tsunamis. But I think we also need to see, well, what impact would it have? And then what can we do about it?
A great point. And that's why I think there's so much overlap between what we do and what emergency managers do, because it's not enough to deal with the hazards. It's all about the aftermath as well. And how do you build back? How do you deal with the social issues and all that? It's a complex, multifaceted problem that requires many, many minds and an interdisciplinary approach. Sure.
Yep, for sure.
Yeah. Well, it was fascinating to read your treatise there to Congress and the transportation folks. Do you think they listened? Do you think the Coast Guard, everybody took what you said to heart?
I don't know if that particular meeting, if I had much influence on it, but I think in general, there's a lot of groups, including the federal government, that are taking this to heart. I was just at a meeting last week. Actually, it was a really cool meeting. It was at the U.S. Naval Academy.
Oh, really? Annapolis. Right.
Down in Annapolis. And it was partially organized by the American Society of Civil Engineers and the Naval Facilities Command, NAVFAC. And
please go ahead.
NAVFAC, one of their big things is they have to operate at sea level, right? They're the Navy. So they're operating all these facilities for the Navy at sea level. And that sea level is going to change over time. But you can't, even if you knew with perfect certainty what the sea level will be in 100 years, it doesn't help you. You can't build to that, because now your docks are here and your boats are here. Yeah. So they're interested in what are these solutions that are adaptive, so that we don't have to just, unlike a highway bridge where you just say, okay, let's just add 3 feet to the bridge.
Right.
For the mission of the Navy with dry docks and things like that, they have to still operate and then just adjust over time. And so there was a much different conversation. I think that gets to what I was saying earlier, one solution for the highway department is not the same solution for ports and harbors. So it was really interesting conversations on, well, what are the options? What can we be doing? What are the solutions that are out there?
Sounds very interesting, very applicable to what Dr. Burke is doing. And we talked about the Planned Integration for Resilience scorecard in the first episode of Shoreside. And he, of course, his system's trying to identify overlaps and how to handle those overlaps and just decouple all the conflicts and everything. So I think we're all getting to be aware of these issues and trying to fix them.
Exactly. And I think trying to come up with some solutions or range of solutions that people can work on. One of the more recent things too is looking at engineering with nature as a possible solution, because nature adapts, that's kind of what it does. And so if we're looking for these adaptive solutions, we're trying to think about, potentially, for example, using vegetation to reduce the surge or the wave climate, right, and then just let vegetation adapt over time.
Reminds me of, I'm sure you know about this, it reminds me of the USVI, the Virgin Islands, incorporating mangroves into their response plans, because they're a natural barrier for a lot of the surges.
Exactly. And that's, one of the tricky things, though, is, let's say, for example, would an engineering company put their name on it? How much would they want to risk their reputation on something they've never done before?
True.
And so, it's one thing for, let's say, a scientist to say, "Oh, this is what we ought to do," but then would an engineering firm, or would they say, "Oh yeah, I'll do it. I'll take all the risk"? That's a tough one. So I think trying to document carefully where these stories have been successful, or people have tried and it's been successful, and then also maybe through laboratory testing or computer models, let's just see how the vegetation or these natural solutions would play out.
Ooh, I think you just identified one of the major hurdles we have to clear that nobody thinks about. It's not enough then to have these good ideas. We also have to sell these good ideas, and therein lies the rub.
Exactly. I think it's just thinking about what people are comfortable with. Not just a community that says, "Yep, I'd rather see green than gray," but an engineering firm or an insurance company. Well, I'm not sure I can insure an unproven technology, whether green or gray. So that's, I think, one part of it. I think another one too is new construction is different than renovation. I think we've all had an old house, and you pull down some plaster and you're like, "Oh crap, what was behind that wall?" Our shorelines are like an old house, like since we've expanded 1950s, 60s, we've got built up shorelines. And so one of the other challenges isn't how do I engineer something or solve something on a blank piece of paper, but how do I do it with all of this legacy infrastructure that sometimes you can't touch it. And so can I add to it? What would I add, and how would I, and in what way would I adapt or add to existing infrastructure? So that's the other big challenge, isn't so much the blank piece of paper and how would I do a perfect job, but how do I fix stuff that's already there?
It's a delicate thing. It's a very delicate thing. And all about this because you've been involved with it for so long. Also with other bright minds, I want to drop the name of one of those people that you might know, Clay Nato. What can you tell us about Clay Nato?
Sure. Wrote a paper with Clay, actually a couple ones. He was one of the colleagues that I went on a tour in Japan with, looking at some of the damages and the losses, and then specifically on debris. And he had just how the debris moves, where does it go? And he had some really interesting ideas of just using Google Earth images. So Google is fairly new at the time.
Sure.
And a really nice technique of initially boots on the ground, get a lay of the land, what's going on, but then having his graduate students follow up with a lot of the aerial work remotely, and eventually came up with a methodology to identify how debris would spread during a tsunami and what would be at risk, for example, from a container yard or a harbor with a bunch of boats. And that ended up with a really nice work product that ended up going into the standards for tsunamis. But he also helped me kind of think of this idea of this combined boots on the ground and remote damage assessment. So that was kind of cool to learn that from him. And then we were also working together on a large experiment, physical model study. That was kind of cool too.
Absolutely. And I like that connection because it's important because of the ASCE. And now it's on its 7th big release, if I'm not mistaken. And that's really because of you. You had a big role in that. What can you tell the people about the American Society of Civil Engineers and then what you did for them? Sure.
So ASCE 7 is a standards document which describes the minimum standard for construction of mostly buildings, new buildings, a few other things, but mostly buildings. And the document is broken up into a series of chapters, and many of these chapters are specific to a particular hazard like wind or earthquakes. And there was a new chapter on tsunamis that was developed. I got to participate in that one. I wasn't the leader on that one. But how you design and build something to resist tsunami loads. And that ended up being one of our buildings here on campus that we put out on the coast was the second building built to those standards in the country and provides vertical evacuation. People can go up on the top of the roof when a tsunami hits. So it's pretty cool. The nice thing is that got me into the standards arena. And then I had a chance to work on the next chapter or the previous chapter, which is chapter 5 on flood loads. And so that's been a long-standing chapter, but didn't really evolve very much over time. It was kind of locked in to kind of the level of standard that it was because there were so many other flood-related documents. But last cycle, we decided it's time to change. Like we have to change the flood standards in the United States. So I got to lead a group of 15 people to totally revise the flood standards for the United States.
That sounds like quite a task. Revising the standards for the entire country then.
Yeah, it's a national standard. It's produced by the American Society of Civil Engineers. And then there's a cycle where the standards get adopted by the IBC, International Building Code. And then those building codes then get adopted by the local jurisdictions. They decide whether or not they want to accept that for their codes. So standard is more like an agreed upon way of doing things among engineering practice. Code becomes law, which is enforceable. So we worked on the engineering practice, and now we're in the process of it potentially becoming code and then being adopted by communities.
Well, with that in mind, what's the bottom line then for these standards? What's the end game, and are we getting better about building along the coast?
Yeah, that's the big question. So our proposal, number one, was to go beyond the existing limits, which is the existing limit is called the 100-year floodplain or the special flood hazard area.
Okay.
What we saw after some of these big hurricanes, it was the area outside the 100-year, out to about the 500-year floodplain that we're seeing major losses, financial losses. So one of the issues is once you go past this 100-year, you have no standards and you have no insurance. You really don't have much at all, and that's why these losses are so high. So our first order of business was to say we need to go beyond this 100-year flood. We need to go out to the 500 years. What we thought is adequate for now, and it was not coincidentally the same limit that some local jurisdictions like Harris County, City of Houston, were already moving to this standard after Hurricane Harvey. So we were just looking nationally, a lot of the communities that were hardest hit were already taking things into their own hands. Hey, we got to make these tougher standards. The problem is it's totally reactive for the rest of the country to sort of wait for a disaster. Now I'll move, wait for a disaster. So our thinking was we should just build up the national standard. Hopefully communities start to adopt them, and then they're at a better place going forward.
I'd say that's a good way to hedge bets. Try to get to the apex of that pyramid, affect the standards up top first, and then hopefully they can trickle down and everything instead of going bottom up. Yeah.
I think that's the goal. And then part of the other issue is that ASE 7 isn't standalone for flood because there are other documents. There's even another ASE standard called 24, flood resistant design, which has to do with how we flood proof homes, how we elevate homes and other things. And there's also FEMA technical documents and guidance documents. So when a designer puts something out there, they have to go through lots of different documents. And so part of this is move one, but then make all the others consistent. So we've been having conversations with FEMA and other groups on, are we going to get consistency moving forward?
And is it likely? Do you think it'll happen?
Yeah, I think it'll happen. I think and it'll be financial reasons, like, for example, insurance industries might start just backing out if we don't do something. And that's the biggest risk, I think, is definitely there's a risk to life safety, but there's also just a risk to an unwillingness to, back some of these places if they're not starting to increase their standards. And so I think, if you say I'm driving a better car now, it's got this crash rating. Okay, maybe your insurance goes down a little bit, or if there are other things you can do to, decrease your insurance rates for your car. Think of that. Okay, now you're the mayor. You got to think about the whole community. Are you starting to adopt these stricter standards for buildings? Then the recovery process is going to be easier if you get hit by an event. It doesn't even have to be the worst in 100-year event. It can just be, we got hit by a pretty hard storm this year, but the building stock is doing okay. The utilities, the water, the power is coming back more quickly. It just helps businesses and people get on with their lives more quickly.
Sure. And that, of course, is the ultimate goal. That's definitely a big pie to have your finger in, but not the only pie you've got your fingers in. You got a lot going on. You're also, I understand, a premier editor on not just one, but 3 academic journals. And with that in mind, what can you tell us about sustainable and resilient infrastructure?
Yeah, so on that one, I'm assistant, I believe, or associate. And I think that's a fairly new journal. And my role is to, help review papers and encourage people to submit there. I think the title just kind of speaks to where we are, resilient and sustainable. And again, as a new journal, it's really trying to push these ideas forward and the research forward. For example, can we do to make communities bounce back more quickly? Can we actually predict that? Can we model it? What are some of the theories behind it? So Resilient and Sustainable Infrastructure is a great journal for trying to look at the science behind community resilience.
It's very much within your wheelhouse. If there's anybody that should be editing that journal, it is definitely you. I want to toss out 2 names, Bob Dean and Tony Dalrymple. Do they mean anything to you?
Yeah, of course. So Bob Dean is, you'd say, the godfather of coastal engineering in the U.S. in some ways, or one of the dons, I guess. But I met him personally a couple of times. He left a very strong impression on me. I think the thing I remember the most is when he told me, curiosity and hard work, that'll get you a long way. Because I was sort of, as a PhD student, kind of doubting, am I doing anything useful? Is it any good? And he said, don't worry, curiosity and hard work. And I remember when he told me that. So that's kind of come back to me a couple of times. But I think the pioneering work that he did on beach nourishment and coastal solutions, he was very solutions oriented, engineering, like take science, but make it useful. I just really like that style. He reminds me a lot of Goda, the other professor that I met in Japan, who just said, we got to solve the problem. It's not study the problem, it's solve the problem. So I think they were contemporaries and made really strong impressions. Tony as well. Tony, I still keep in contact with. He was one of my major professors. Also really helped me a ton in my career to get where I'm going. And I think a lot of what I do now is just kind of repaying these guys back, trying to help the next generation.
And that is the key. And you've done that, and you've got a Caribbean connection from that. You've mentored a lot of students from University of Puerto Rico at Mayagüez, correct?
Yeah, we had a nice connection with the students coming up really through this Coastal Research Center. It was really established with Ismail Pagan, and I met him through this center, and I really liked the workforce development aspect of it. And he was a fellow engineer, so we kind of connected immediately. And then he just said, "How many do you need?" And just really encouraged his students to, take a chance up here in the Northwest, which, for us, I'm just thinking of myself when I was an undergrad student, to fly across the country was a big deal. Here they're coming all the way up to the Northwest sight unseen. Interesting story is that Diego Delgado was the first cohort of these students. Great pioneer, pioneering spirit to come out here. He ended up going to graduate school in Spain for coastal engineering and got a job for a coastal engineering company down in Florida. And couple of years ago, we were looking for a place to go in Florida, talking to a consulting company. They invited us down to look at the mangroves and some of the engineering with nature studies. And Diego was one of their junior engineers on the trip. I couldn't believe we were, back together. And it was just fantastic to see how this program that DHS has put together is, it works. That's one anecdotal evidence, but it's just awesome to see somebody go from the undergraduate research student. They get excited about coastal engineering as a field. They go somewhere else for their degree, and then are in the workforce, and then still doing incredible work. So it's kind of I think a highlight of my career to be able to see people like Diego doing good. I mean, it's fantastic.
Really is a beautiful thing. Our listeners may not know this, but it is National Preparedness Month as designated by FEMA. And one of the big things that we do to prepare is training the next generation of coastal engineers. And that's one of the biggest gifts that we can give to the world, just passing the torch off. And it seems like you've done that in a wonderful way for many, many up and coming coastal resilience rock stars. And it's fantastic to hear about it. It really is, because, like you said, some very, very bright minds coming up in this environment. Have you had any other interactions with students outside of Puerto Rico?
With
graduate students and all that.
Yeah, for sure. I mentioned the conference I went to last week. I was speaking down at the Naval Academy, and one of the hosts was our former postdoctoral scholar here, Tori Tomasek. So it's, again, it's cool to see. And then she gave an incredible presentation about the resilience efforts that the Academy is going through to, account for sea level rise and the compound flooding and all that kind of stuff. So it's great to see her, extremely successful in her work. We're still working together on some of the engineering with nature projects. So I do try to keep in touch with the graduate students and, see how they're doing and whether they're doing well. So it's been pretty good to keep in touch with them.
Outstanding. I know we're coming up on time here. Before we wrap up, let me ask you. We talk a lot about climate change, and you know so much about tsunamis. Can you say whether there's any kind of connection between changing climates and coastal disasters coming up?
Any connection between the climate change and any disaster?
Right. Well, coast to coastal disasters. Are temperatures rising, and is that rising temperature affecting what we're seeing in terms of hurricane seasons or anything else like that?
Yeah, that's a great question. I don't know the answer to, intensity and frequency of the hurricanes. I do know though that the sea level rise is putting whatever's there at higher risk. And so even without the changing hurricane conditions, just the fact that the water level is getting higher and higher when those hurricanes hit, it's a big deal. It's a big deal for two reasons. One is, of course, the water level is higher, but over time, that higher water level causes more coastal erosion. So you're actually not just losing in the up and down direction, you're losing across too. That, we mentioned early, about how these barrier islands are moving and the sands are shifting. A lot of that is, the response to sea level rise. And so it's going to cause more shoreline loss. So I think we've got kind of a double whammy on that one with sea level rise. And it's changing at different rates in different parts of the country, but something we have to really think about how we're going to adapt to increased sea levels.
Something we have to discuss in the future for sure. I can foresee another episode just talking about that, you and me. That's a fascinating subject, but we'll have to save that for episode 5 or 6. We got all the time in the world, though. Shoreside will continue. We are coming up on time, though. Dr. Cox, is there anything at all that you want to tell the people? Anything about your life, storm modeling, tennis with Dr. Robert Whalen, anything at all?
I think for me, it's really just go to where what problem are we trying to solve? And I think keeping that in mind, that people have everybody has a different notion of it. And I think before we try to solve a problem, I think we all have to kind of discuss, hey, this is the problem we're trying to solve. And if it's, having a healthy community, good quality of life, what does that mean to us as a society, not just impose a bunch of rules. So I think for engineering, we really have to think first, what problem are we trying to solve? What are we trying to help with? Go from there. And now let's, help out with the solutions. That's kind of my mindset right now.
The mission comes first, but the people come always.
Absolutely.
The bottom line, right? Dr. Cox.
We're working for society. Yep.
Yes, indeed. For society, for everybody, for us all. It's a complex problem. And I look forward to discussing it more with you and the rest of our wonderful colleagues as Shoreside continues. Dr. Cox, thank you so much for coming on the show. We really, really appreciate having you here.
It's been a pleasure. Thank you.
Most definitely. Shoreside is a production of the Coastal Resilience Center. Make sure you check out our Linktree to follow all of our socials at Linktree/Coastal Resilience. You can see our YouTube, our LinkedIn, our Facebook, everything. Check it out. Like, comment, subscribe. Also, our website, coastalresilience.org. That is our home on the World Wide Web. Thank you so much for tuning in. We are so very thrilled to be seeing you Shoreside. Bruce Rosenblum signing out from Shoreside. We'll see you again real soon.